My name is Emily Carter, and I am an American English teacher who has spent many years helping professionals, executives, diplomats, and ambitious learners master the kind of English that rarely appears in traditional textbooks. Today marks the beginning of a much larger journey that will eventually take us through debate, negotiation, leadership, persuasion, crisis management, philosophy, and the development of a powerful personal voice. Before we can reach any of those destinations, however, we must first learn one of the most important skills in advanced communication, the art of strategic ambiguity and professional courtesy. Many learners assume that advanced English means speaking more directly, more confidently, and more forcefully. In reality, the most respected communicators are often those who understand when not to be completely direct. They know how to soften criticism, express disagreement without hostility, and create room for discussion rather than resistance. I learned this lesson early in my career while attending a conference in Washington, D.C. The event brought together economists, political analysts, and corporate leaders from around the world. During one session, two experts held completely opposing views on a major policy issue. I expected a heated argument, yet what I witnessed was something far more sophisticated. One speaker did not say, "Your argument is wrong." Instead, he calmly remarked, "That perspective is arguably incomplete when examined through a broader historical framework." The second speaker did not respond with hostility. She simply replied, "While that interpretation may hold merit in certain contexts, it potentially overlooks several critical variables." The disagreement was obvious, but the atmosphere remained respectful. Everyone in the room continued listening because nobody felt attacked. That experience revealed a truth that transformed the way I taught English. Language is not merely a tool for expressing thoughts. It is also a tool for managing emotions. The words we choose can either invite cooperation or provoke defensiveness. When people feel threatened, they stop listening. When they feel respected, they remain open to new ideas. This psychological reality explains why advanced speakers frequently rely on hedging devices. Hedging refers to language that intentionally softens the certainty or strength of a statement. Rather than presenting opinions as absolute truths, hedging presents them as thoughtful possibilities worthy of discussion. Consider the difference between saying, "This proposal is unrealistic," and saying, "This proposal appears somewhat unrealistic under current market conditions." Both statements communicate concern. However, the second version sounds far more professional because it avoids absolute judgment. The listener is less likely to feel personally criticized. This distinction may seem small, yet it can dramatically affect the outcome of a conversation. In business, politics, academia, and diplomacy, relationships often matter just as much as facts. A brilliant idea delivered aggressively may fail, while a carefully framed observation may influence an entire room. Among the most useful hedging words are presumably, arguably, potentially, apparently, seemingly, relatively, and perhaps. Each word introduces a degree of uncertainty that makes communication more flexible. If I say, "The project failed because of poor leadership," my statement sounds harsh and definitive. If I say, "The project presumably encountered difficulties related to leadership decisions," I communicate a similar idea while leaving space for alternative explanations. Likewise, if I say, "Your strategy is ineffective," the statement may feel confrontational. If I instead say, "Your strategy appears relatively ineffective compared with current industry standards," the criticism becomes more analytical and less personal. One reason hedging is so powerful is that it demonstrates intellectual humility. Highly educated individuals rarely claim absolute certainty because they understand how complex reality can be. The more knowledge people acquire, the more aware they become of uncertainty. This is why professors, researchers, and experienced executives frequently use expressions such as "the evidence suggests," "it would appear that," or "there is reason to believe." These phrases do not indicate weakness. On the contrary, they often signal sophistication. They acknowledge complexity while maintaining credibility. Another essential tool in diplomatic communication is the use of modal verbs. Words such as might, may, could, would, and should allow speakers to adjust the force of their message. Imagine a manager saying, "You must rewrite this report." The instruction is clear, but it may sound severe. Now imagine the manager saying, "You might want to revisit several sections of this report." The practical meaning remains similar, yet the emotional impact changes dramatically. The second version encourages cooperation rather than resistance. I often tell my students that modal verbs function like a volume control knob. Instead of speaking at maximum intensity all the time, advanced communicators adjust their linguistic volume according to the situation. During a sensitive meeting, saying, "We could explore alternative solutions," may be far more effective than saying, "Your solution is wrong." Likewise, saying, "We may need additional data before reaching a conclusion," sounds considerably more diplomatic than saying, "We do not have enough information." The difference lies not only in grammar but also in psychology. Qualifying adjectives perform a similar role. Words such as possible, probable, limited, moderate, preliminary, partial, and tentative help reduce the rigidity of a statement. Suppose an executive presents a disappointing quarterly report. Declaring, "The results are bad," offers little value and may damage morale. Describing the results as moderately disappointing or below preliminary expectations communicates concern while preserving professionalism. Language of this kind helps leaders address problems without creating unnecessary conflict. Throughout my career, I have observed that many non-native speakers struggle with this concept because they were taught that directness equals confidence. While confidence is important, excessive directness can sometimes be interpreted as arrogance or insensitivity. Native speakers in professional environments often evaluate communication not only by what is said but also by how it is said. A person who consistently leaves room for discussion is frequently perceived as more mature, more collaborative, and more trustworthy. I remember coaching a talented engineer who regularly attended international meetings. His technical knowledge was exceptional, yet his colleagues often reacted negatively to his comments. During one meeting, he bluntly stated, "This design will fail." Although he intended to help, his words created tension. We later revised the statement together. At the next meeting, he said, "This design could potentially encounter several challenges during implementation." The response from the group was entirely different. People listened carefully, asked questions, and engaged in constructive discussion. The technical content remained almost identical, but the linguistic framing changed everything. Professional courtesy becomes particularly important when declining proposals. Inexperienced speakers sometimes say, "No, that will not work." More sophisticated communicators often prefer expressions such as, "While I appreciate the suggestion, we may need to explore other options," or, "That is certainly an interesting approach, though there might be alternative strategies worth considering." Notice how these responses acknowledge the other person's contribution before introducing disagreement. This simple habit protects relationships while preserving honesty. Diplomatic language also proves valuable when delivering criticism. Effective criticism focuses on ideas rather than individuals. Instead of saying, "You made a mistake," a skilled communicator might say, "There appears to be a discrepancy in this section." Instead of saying, "Your presentation was weak," they may say, "Several aspects of the presentation could potentially be strengthened." Such language encourages improvement without triggering embarrassment or defensiveness. As an American teacher, I find this especially important because many professional environments in the United States place significant emphasis on collaboration. Even highly competitive organizations often expect employees to disagree respectfully. The goal is not to avoid disagreement. The goal is to manage disagreement productively. Strategic ambiguity allows people to challenge ideas while preserving mutual respect. It creates an atmosphere where innovation can flourish because individuals feel safe expressing opinions. The deeper I study communication, the more I realize that diplomacy is not about hiding the truth. It is about delivering the truth in a form that people are willing to hear. There is a profound difference between honesty and bluntness. Honest communication seeks understanding. Blunt communication often prioritizes emotional release. Advanced speakers understand that effectiveness matters more than momentary satisfaction. They choose words that move conversations forward rather than pushing people apart. As we conclude this first lesson, I want you to remember that mastery of English involves far more than vocabulary and grammar. True mastery requires awareness of psychology, relationships, culture, and context. Every hedge, modal verb, and qualifying adjective serves a purpose. These linguistic tools help us navigate uncertainty, maintain professionalism, and influence others with grace rather than force. They transform communication from a simple exchange of information into a sophisticated exercise in human connection. In the lessons ahead, we will build upon this foundation. Once a speaker has mastered the art of diplomatic softening, they become capable of introducing disagreement without causing offense. They learn how to challenge assumptions, question conclusions, and dismantle weak arguments while maintaining credibility and respect. That progression naturally leads us into the next stage of our journey, where strategic courtesy meets intellectual confrontation, and where the careful language of diplomacy evolves into the structured and fascinating world of advanced debate and tactical counter-arguing. As we concluded our previous lesson, we established that diplomatic language is not about avoiding disagreement, but about preparing the ground for disagreement to occur productively. Once a speaker learns how to soften criticism, introduce uncertainty, and preserve relationships through strategic courtesy, a new challenge emerges. Sooner or later, every thoughtful person encounters an idea they genuinely believe is flawed. At that moment, diplomacy alone is not enough. The speaker must possess the ability to examine arguments, identify weaknesses, and respond with intellectual precision rather than emotional reaction. This is where our journey naturally advances into the fascinating world of advanced debating and tactical counter-arguing. I still remember the first formal debate I attended after becoming a teacher. The event took place at a prestigious university, and the room was filled with professors, researchers, journalists, and policy experts. I entered expecting an aggressive battle of personalities. Instead, I witnessed something entirely different. The strongest participants rarely raised their voices. They did not rely on charisma alone. Rather, they demonstrated an extraordinary ability to dissect reasoning itself. They focused not on attacking people, but on examining assumptions, evidence, logic, and conclusions. Watching them felt like observing skilled surgeons performing delicate intellectual operations. One lesson from that experience has remained with me ever since. Winning an argument is not the same as defeating a person. Inexperienced debaters often confuse the two. They assume that sounding forceful proves superiority. Yet advanced communicators understand that credibility grows when criticism remains focused on ideas rather than individuals. The moment a discussion becomes personal, logic begins to disappear. Emotional reactions replace rational analysis, and meaningful progress becomes increasingly difficult. For this reason, the language of sophisticated debate is carefully structured to challenge arguments without unnecessarily provoking hostility. At the heart of advanced debate lies a simple question. Why should anyone accept a particular conclusion? Every argument contains components that can be examined. There are assumptions, pieces of evidence, logical connections, interpretations, and predictions. When one of these elements proves weak, the entire argument may become vulnerable. Skilled debaters, therefore, spend less time expressing opinions and more time evaluating how conclusions were reached. Instead of saying, "I disagree," they ask questions such as, "What evidence supports that conclusion?" Or, "How does that premise logically lead to your proposed outcome?" These questions transform disagreement into analysis. One of the most valuable expressions in professional debate is the phrase, "That premise holds no water when subjected to scrutiny." I first heard this expression during a public policy discussion involving economic forecasts. A participant confidently predicted a specific outcome based on a single statistic. Another expert calmly responded, "That premise holds no water when subjected to scrutiny because it fails to account for regional variation." The room immediately focused on the reasoning rather than the personality of the speaker. The phrase itself carries a powerful message. It does not merely reject an idea. It explains that the foundation supporting the idea cannot withstand careful examination. Another essential skill involves recognizing logical fallacies. A logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning that creates the illusion of a strong argument while concealing weakness beneath the surface. One common example occurs when people attack the person rather than the argument. During a discussion, someone might say, "You cannot trust her opinion because she was wrong before." Notice that the speaker avoids addressing the actual argument. Instead, attention shifts toward the individual. Advanced communicators immediately recognize this tactic and redirect the conversation back toward evidence and logic. Another frequently encountered fallacy involves false dilemmas. In this situation, a speaker presents only two possible options despite the existence of many alternatives. I once attended a corporate meeting where a manager declared, "Either we implement this strategy immediately or the company will fail." The statement sounded dramatic, yet the reasoning was deeply flawed. There were numerous potential courses of action between those extremes. A more sophisticated response might be, "With all due respect, your conclusion appears to be predicated on a limited set of assumptions that excludes several viable alternatives." Such language challenges the reasoning while maintaining professionalism. The phrase, "with all due respect," deserves special attention because it occupies a unique position in advanced English communication. When used sincerely and appropriately, it signals that disagreement is directed toward the argument rather than the person. Of course, tone matters enormously. If spoken sarcastically, the phrase may create the opposite effect. However, when delivered with genuine professionalism, it allows a speaker to introduce substantial criticism while preserving respect. This balance becomes particularly important in environments where hierarchy and reputation influence communication. As my teaching career progressed, I've began coaching executives who frequently participated in high-stakes negotiations and public discussions. Many possessed extensive technical expertise, but struggled when confronting opposing viewpoints. Their instinct was often to overwhelm opponents with facts. While evidence is undeniably important, effective refutation requires more than information. It requires structure. A skilled debater first identifies the central claim, then isolates the assumption supporting that claim, evaluates the quality of evidence, and finally demonstrates where the reasoning breaks down. This systematic approach prevents discussions from descending into chaos. Imagine a colleague arguing that remote work inevitably reduces productivity because several employees missed deadlines. At first glance, the conclusion may appear reasonable. Yet a closer examination reveals significant weaknesses. The evidence is limited, the sample size is small, and alternative explanations remain unexplored. Rather than responding emotionally, an advanced speaker might say, "I would question whether the available evidence sufficiently supports such a broad conclusion." This response neither insults nor dismisses. Instead, it encourages deeper analysis. Vocabulary also plays a crucial role in intellectual debate. Words such as premise, assertion, inference, assumption, correlation, causation, validity, and credibility allow speakers to discuss reasoning with precision. Consider the difference between saying, "That does not make sense," and saying, "The inference appears unsupported by the evidence presented." Both statements express skepticism, yet the second demonstrates analytical sophistication. Precision creates authority. The more accurately we describe weaknesses in reasoning, the more persuasive our responses become. One of my favorite exercises involves teaching students to distinguish between correlation and causation. Human beings naturally seek patterns, yet patterns alone do not establish cause and effect. Suppose someone argues that increased coffee consumption causes professional success because successful executives frequently drink coffee. The relationship may exist, but the conclusion remains questionable. Countless other factors could contribute to success. Recognizing this distinction protects us from accepting attractive yet misleading arguments. It also enables us to challenge flawed reasoning in a calm and credible manner. Psychology plays an equally important role in debate. Most people do not change their minds simply because they encounter stronger evidence. Emotions, identity, and personal experience often shape beliefs as much as facts do. Understanding this reality helps us communicate more effectively. Rather than humiliating opponents, skilled communicators guide them toward reconsideration. They create opportunities for reflection instead of forcing immediate surrender. This approach may appear slower, yet it frequently produces more lasting results. I learned this lesson during a community discussion several years ago. Two participants disagreed passionately about an educational policy. One speaker aggressively attempted to prove the other wrong, presenting statistics with increasing intensity. The second speaker adopted a different strategy. She asked thoughtful questions, acknowledged valid concerns, and gradually exposed contradictions in the opposing position. By the end of the conversation, several audience members had shifted their perspectives. Interestingly, they did so without feeling pressured. The experience reminded me that persuasion often succeeds through curiosity rather than confrontation. Advanced debate, therefore, requires a combination of logic, language, and emotional intelligence. Logic identifies weaknesses. Language communicates those weaknesses effectively. Emotional intelligence ensures that communication remains productive. Remove any one of these elements, and the quality of the discussion declines. Strong reasoning delivered aggressively may create resistance. Polite language without analytical rigor accomplishes little. Emotional awareness without evidence lacks persuasive power. True mastery emerges only when all three dimensions work together. As we move toward the conclusion of this lesson, I want you to view debate not as a battlefield, but as an investigation. The objective is not to destroy opponents. The objective is to discover stronger ideas. Every challenge, every question, and every counterargument serves a larger purpose. Through careful scrutiny, weak assumptions are exposed, stronger explanations emerge, and understanding deepens. This mindset transforms disagreement from a source of conflict into a catalyst for intellectual growth. Yet debate itself is rarely the final destination. Even the most sophisticated argument eventually reaches a point where both sides have revealed their evidence, defended their positions, and tested each other's reasoning. At that stage, continuing the intellectual battle often produces diminishing returns. Decisions still need to be made, relationships must be maintained, and practical outcomes become increasingly important. Consequently, the focus shifts away from proving who is right and toward determining what is possible. That transition leads naturally into the next phase of our journey. Once arguments have been examined, assumptions challenged, and conclusions tested, the conversation enters a more strategic arena. The participants are no longer merely exchanging ideas. They are seeking workable solutions, balancing competing interests, and identifying acceptable compromises. In other words, the art of debate gradually gives way to the art of negotiation. In our next lesson, we will explore how skilled communicators transform intellectual confrontation into strategic cooperation, learning how to secure favorable outcomes, make calculated concessions, and navigate the complex language of high-stakes negotiation. As we concluded our previous lesson, we arrived at an important realization. Debate, no matter how sophisticated, cannot continue forever. Eventually, the strongest arguments have been presented, the weakest assumptions have been exposed, and every participant understands where the others stand. At that moment, a new challenge emerges. The objective is no longer to prove who is correct. The objective becomes finding a path forward that serves competing interests while preserving valuable relationships. This transition marks our entry into the world of high-stakes negotiation, a realm where language itself becomes a form of leverage. I discovered the true power of negotiation language during a consulting project early in my teaching career. A multinational company was attempting to finalize a partnership involving millions of dollars. Representatives from both organizations possessed exceptional intelligence, extensive experience, and seemingly endless data. Yet despite weeks of meetings, progress remained painfully slow. What fascinated me was that the obstacle was not information. Everyone understood the facts. The obstacle was language. Small differences in wording transformed cooperative discussions into tense standoffs, while carefully chosen phrases suddenly reopened doors that had appeared permanently closed. One afternoon, I watched two senior executives discuss a contentious financial provision. One executive stated, "We cannot accept those terms." The conversation immediately stalled. The statement was clear, yet it created a wall. A few minutes later, another executive rephrased the position. He said, "We might be amenable to exploring alternatives, provided that our core financial objectives remain protected." Instantly, the atmosphere changed. The essential position remained unchanged, but the language introduced possibility. That moment taught me that negotiation is often less about demands and more about framing. The phrase "provided that" is among the most powerful expressions in advanced negotiation. It allows a speaker to make conditional offers without appearing weak or inflexible. Rather than surrendering value, the speaker exchanges value. Consider the difference between saying, "We will reduce the price," and saying, "We may be willing to reduce the price, provided that the contract term is extended." The first statement gives something away. The second transforms a concession into a strategic trade. Skilled negotiators rarely offer benefits without receiving something in return. Throughout my years teaching executives, entrepreneurs, and managers, I noticed that successful negotiators think in terms of conditions rather than positions. Inexperienced negotiators often become trapped by rigid declarations. They say, "This is our offer," and defend it endlessly. Experienced negotiators instead ask, "Under what circumstances might movement become possible?" This subtle shift changes the entire conversation. It encourages creativity, reduces confrontation, and increases the likelihood of mutually beneficial outcomes. One of the most important vocabulary categories in negotiation involves conditional language. Expressions such as "provided that," "on the condition that," "assuming that," "contingent upon," "subject to," and "in exchange for" create flexibility while maintaining control. Imagine a supplier saying, "We can accelerate delivery." The statement sounds helpful, but incomplete. Now imagine the supplier saying, "We can accelerate delivery, contingent upon receiving final approval by Friday." The second version establishes clear expectations. It protects the speaker while offering cooperation. Psychology plays a central role in this process. Human beings naturally resist feeling pressured or cornered. When individuals believe they have no choices, they often become defensive. Conditional language creates the perception of options. It allows both parties to feel involved in shaping the outcome. As a result, discussions become more collaborative. This psychological principle explains why effective negotiators rarely issue ultimatums unless absolutely necessary. They understand that perceived freedom often encourages agreement more effectively than direct pressure. Another critical element of boardroom communication involves strategic concession. Many people mistakenly view concessions as signs of weakness. In reality, carefully planned concessions can strengthen a negotiator's position. The key lies in making concessions visible and valuable. If a concession appears effortless, it may receive little appreciation. If it appears thoughtful and intentional, it often generates reciprocity. I frequently advise my students to avoid making multiple concessions simultaneously because doing so reduces perceived value and weakens leverage. I remember observing a negotiation between two organizations discussing a long-term service agreement. One side immediately accepted several requests in an attempt to appear cooperative. Surprisingly, their flexibility produced the opposite effect. The other side interpreted the rapid concessions as evidence that additional concessions were available. Demands increased rather than decreased. Later, a more experienced negotiator joined the discussion. He carefully framed each adjustment as a meaningful compromise linked to a corresponding benefit. The dynamic shifted dramatically because value is being exchanged rather than surrendered. Language allows negotiators to frame concessions effectively. Expressions such as, "We may be prepared to consider that option," "We could potentially accommodate that request," or "We would be willing to explore that possibility under certain circumstances," communicate openness while preserving control. These phrases avoid commitment until appropriate conditions are clarified. They also prevent the speaker from appearing desperate, which is essential in high-stakes environments where perception influences outcomes. Equally important is the ability to establish boundaries. Negotiation requires flexibility, but flexibility without limits creates vulnerability. Every skilled negotiator understands the importance of identifying non-negotiable priorities before discussions begin. The challenge lies in communicating those boundaries firmly without damaging relationships. This is where language becomes particularly valuable. Instead of saying, "Absolutely not," advanced speakers often employ more measured expressions that still convey firmness. One of the most effective examples is the phrase, "That represents our absolute bottom line, from which we cannot depart." I first heard this expression during a contract negotiation involving intellectual property rights. The wording was fascinating because it combined professionalism with unmistakable clarity. There was no hostility, no anger, and no personal criticism. Yet the message was completely unambiguous. The speaker had identified a boundary and communicated it in a manner that preserved respect while eliminating uncertainty. Other useful boundary-setting expressions include, "That provision is essential to our position. We would find it extremely difficult to move beyond that point, and our flexibility does not extend to that particular issue." Such phrases help negotiators maintain credibility. They also reduce the likelihood of future misunderstandings because expectations remain clear. Ambiguity can be useful in some stages of negotiation, but clarity becomes essential when defining limits. Trust is another factor that profoundly influences negotiation outcomes. Contrary to popular belief, Trust does not eliminate the need for leverage. Instead, trust enhances the effectiveness of leverage. When people believe that commitments will be honored, they become more willing to explore creative solutions. This is why skilled negotiators pay close attention not only to what is said, but also to whether actions consistently align with previous statements. Credibility accumulates gradually, and once lost, it can be remarkably difficult to restore. I often compare negotiation to building a bridge across a river. Every proposal functions like a plank. Every concession adds another support beam. Every fulfilled commitment strengthens the structure. However, if one side repeatedly makes promises without delivering results, cracks begin to appear. Eventually, the bridge becomes unstable. Language alone cannot compensate for a lack of trustworthiness. Effective communication must be supported by consistent behavior. Another advanced concept involves anchoring. Anchoring occurs when a negotiator introduces a reference point that influences subsequent discussions. The first figure mentioned during a financial negotiation often shapes perceptions of what constitutes a reasonable outcome. This principle extends beyond numbers. Initial expectations, priorities, and definitions can all function as anchors. Skilled communicators therefore choose their opening language carefully because early framing frequently influences everything that follows. I once worked with a business owner preparing for an acquisition discussion. Initially, he planned to begin by defending his company's weaknesses in order to appear transparent. We instead reframed the opening conversation around long-term growth potential, market positioning, and customer loyalty. The underlying facts remained identical, yet the anchor changed. Rather than focusing on limitations, the discussion centered on opportunities. The eventual agreement reflected that shift in perception. The lesson was clear. The way a conversation begins often influences where it ends. As negotiations progress, emotional control becomes increasingly important. High-pressure discussions can trigger frustration, impatience, and fear. Yet, emotional reactions frequently weaken leverage. A negotiator who appears desperate may invite tougher demands. A negotiator who appears angry may undermine trust. For this reason, experienced professionals develop language patterns that allow them to remain composed even during difficult moments. Phrases such as, "Let us take a moment to evaluate that proposal," or "We would like additional time to consider the implications," create space for reflection without signaling weakness. The most successful negotiators I have encountered share a common characteristic. They understand that negotiation is rarely about winning everything. Instead, it is about securing the most favorable outcome achievable under existing circumstances. This perspective encourages pragmatism. It shifts attention away from ego and toward results. Language becomes a tool for shaping possibilities rather than defending pride. When negotiators adopt this mindset, discussions become more productive and less adversarial. As our lesson draws toward its conclusion, I want you to remember that negotiation language operates on several levels simultaneously. Every phrase communicates information, emotion, priorities, and intentions. Conditional offers create flexibility. Strategic concessions generate reciprocity. Firm boundaries establish credibility. Trust strengthens cooperation. Anchoring influences perception. Together, these elements form the linguistic architecture of successful negotiation. Mastering them allows speakers to navigate complex discussions with confidence and precision. Yet, even the most successful negotiation represents only part of a larger journey. Eventually, agreements are signed, terms are finalized, and compromises are accepted. The executive leaves the boardroom carrying a vision that now requires support from employees, stakeholders, customers, or the public. Securing agreement among negotiators is one challenge. Inspiring belief among a wider audience is another entirely. Consequently, our next lesson will move beyond leverage and bargaining into the powerful world of rhetoric, persuasion, and psychological influence, where leaders learn not merely to negotiate a vision, but to make others genuinely want to follow it. As we concluded our previous lesson, we stood at the moment when negotiations had finally produced agreement. The difficult conversations had taken place, the concessions had been exchanged, and the boundaries had been clearly established. Yet every experienced leader understands that securing an agreement inside a boardroom is only the beginning of a much larger challenge. Once the documents are signed and the strategy is finalized, someone must step forward and convince others to believe in that vision. Employees must feel inspired, investors must feel confident, customers must feel optimistic, and communities must feel included. This is where negotiation ends and persuasion begins, and it is here that language transforms from a tool of leverage into a tool of influence. I remember attending a corporate conference in Chicago several years ago, where two executives presented remarkably similar business strategies. On paper, their proposals were nearly identical. Both contained strong data, realistic projections, and practical implementation plans. Yet the reactions from the audience could not have been more different. One presentation was received politely, while the other generated excitement, applause, and genuine enthusiasm. As I listened carefully, I realized that the difference had very little to do with information. The difference lay in rhetoric. One speaker merely communicated facts, while the other transformed those facts into a compelling story that people wanted to believe. That experience taught me a lesson that continues to shape my teaching today. Human beings are not persuaded by information alone. Information appeals to logic, but persuasion requires something more. It requires emotion, imagery, rhythm, and narrative. Throughout history, great leaders, activists, entrepreneurs, and visionaries have understood this principle. They recognized that people rarely follow statistics. They follow meaning. They follow purpose. They follow stories that help them understand who they are and where they might be going. The study of rhetoric, therefore, occupies a unique place in advanced English communication. Rhetoric is not manipulation, at least not in its highest form. Rather, it is the art of presenting ideas in ways that resonate with human psychology. Effective rhetoric allows speakers to organize information so that audiences remember it, feel it, and ultimately act upon it. This process requires far more than vocabulary knowledge. It requires a deep understanding of attention, emotion, memory, and motivation. One of the most powerful rhetorical devices available to a speaker is anaphora, the deliberate repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of successive statements. I often describe anaphora as the heartbeat of persuasive speech because it creates rhythm while reinforcing key ideas. During one leadership seminar, I heard a speaker declare, "We must innovate when others hesitate. We must adapt when others resist. We must lead when others doubt." The audience responded immediately. The repetition created momentum. Each sentence strengthened the one before it, producing a sense of inevitability and collective purpose. Anaphora succeeds because human memory responds naturally to patterns. When people hear repeated structures, their attention increases and their recall improves. Consider the difference between saying, "Our company needs improvement in innovation, culture, and leadership," and saying, "We need innovation in our thinking. We need courage in our culture. We need excellence in our leadership." Both versions communicate similar information, yet the second feels dramatically more memorable. The repetition acts as an anchor that helps the audience absorb the message. I often encourage my students to observe how repetition functions in everyday communication. Parents use repetition when teaching children. Coaches use repetition when motivating athletes. Politicians use repetition when addressing large crowds. Even ordinary conversations contain moments when speakers instinctively repeat key ideas to emphasize importance. Advanced communicators simply apply this instinct deliberately and strategically. They understand that repetition, when used carefully, transforms language into something that lingers in the listener's mind long after the conversation ends. Another rhetorical technique that appears remarkably simple, yet possesses extraordinary influence, is the rule of three. Throughout my career, I have noticed that ideas presented in groups of three tend to feel complete, balanced, and satisfying. We encounter this pattern constantly in speeches, advertising campaigns, literature, and everyday conversation. A leader might promise to create growth, stability, and opportunity. A company might define its values as integrity, innovation, and excellence. The structure feels natural because the human mind processes it efficiently. I first became consciously aware of the rule of three while analyzing famous American speeches with my students. Again and again, I noticed speakers organizing concepts into triads. Sometimes the pattern appeared in nouns, sometimes in verbs, and sometimes in entire clauses. Regardless of the specific form, the effect remained consistent. Three elements provided enough variety to maintain interest, while preserving a sense of unity. Two elements often felt incomplete, while four or more risked becoming difficult to remember. Three occupied a uniquely persuasive middle ground. Imagine an executive introducing a new initiative. If she says, "This project will improve efficiency," the statement may sound reasonable but limited. If she says, "This project will improve efficiency, strengthen collaboration, and accelerate innovation," the vision suddenly feels broader and more compelling. The rule of three expands perception. It creates the impression of completeness, helping audiences view proposals as comprehensive rather than isolated. This subtle psychological effect explains why the pattern appears so frequently among skilled communicators. Yet rhetoric extends far beyond repetition and structure. Some of the most influential communicators rely heavily on metaphorical framing. A metaphor does more than decorate language. It shapes how people interpret reality itself. When leaders describe a company as a ship navigating uncertain waters, they invite listeners to think in terms of direction, teamwork, storms, and destinations. When they describe an organization as a living ecosystem, they encourage entirely different associations involving growth, adaptation, and interdependence. The chosen metaphor becomes a lens through which audiences understand complex situations. I witnessed the power of metaphor during a period of organizational change at a large technology company. Employee morale had declined, uncertainty was widespread, and resistance to new policies was growing. During a company-wide meeting, the chief executive addressed the situation by saying, "We are not standing in the ruins of something broken. We are standing at the foundation of something unfinished." The effect was immediate. The challenges remained exactly the same, yet the emotional interpretation shifted. Employees no longer viewed themselves as victims of decline. They began to see themselves as participants in construction. This illustrates an essential truth about persuasion. Facts matter, but interpretation matters as well. Two individuals may observe the same reality and arrive at completely different emotional conclusions depending on how that reality is framed. Effective speakers understand this dynamic. They do not distort facts. Rather, they help audiences view facts through perspectives that encourage confidence, resilience, or action. Metaphorical framing allows them to accomplish this with remarkable efficiency. Another aspect of advanced persuasion involves authority. Many learners assume that authority comes primarily from status or position. While status certainly contributes, linguistic authority operates differently. Speakers project authority when they communicate with clarity, consistency, and purpose. Hesitation can undermine confidence, while excessive certainty can appear arrogant. The strongest communicators occupy a middle ground. They sound confident without sounding inflexible. They express conviction while remaining open to evidence and discussion. One technique I frequently teach involves replacing weak, passive phrasing with purposeful language. Consider the difference between saying, "We hope this initiative might possibly improve performance," and saying, "We believe this initiative will strengthen performance over time." The second statement sounds more authoritative because it reduces unnecessary uncertainty. Persuasive communication requires balance. Too much caution weakens momentum, while too much certainty damages credibility. Skilled speakers calibrate their language carefully according to context. Emotion also plays a central role in persuasion. For many years, I believed that emotional appeals and logical appeals existed in opposition to one another. Experience eventually taught me otherwise. The most effective communicators integrate both. They support their claims with evidence while simultaneously connecting those claims to human hopes, fears, aspirations, and values. Logic provides justification, but emotion provides motivation. Without motivation, even the strongest arguments may fail to inspire action. I remember coaching an entrepreneur preparing to present her vision to potential investors. Initially, her presentation consisted almost entirely of financial projections and technical details. The information was accurate, but it lacked emotional resonance. Together, we restructured the presentation to include the personal story that inspired her company. We connected the business model to real human experiences. The numbers remained important, yet they became part of a larger narrative. The response improved dramatically because the audience finally understood not only what she wanted to build, but also why it mattered. As speakers develop rhetorical skill, they gradually learn to think beyond individual sentences. They begin shaping entire emotional journeys. Every introduction establishes expectations. Every example reinforces themes. Every metaphor influences perception. Every repetition strengthens memory. The speech becomes more than a collection of ideas. It becomes an experience. Audiences stop merely listening and begin participating mentally and emotionally in the narrative being presented. This transformation explains why rhetoric has remained relevant for thousands of years. Technologies change, industries evolve, and societies transform, yet human psychology remains remarkably consistent. People continue seeking meaning, purpose, identity, and direction. Speakers who understand these desires can communicate with extraordinary effectiveness. They can inspire confidence during uncertainty, unity during division, and action during moments of hesitation. As we conclude this lesson, I want you to recognize that rhetoric is not simply about sounding impressive. It is about helping ideas travel from one mind to another with clarity and impact. Anaphora creates rhythm and emphasis. The rule of three creates balance and memorability. Metaphorical framing shapes perception and emotional understanding. Authority strengthens credibility, while emotional connection transforms information into motivation. Together, these tools allow speakers to move audiences rather than merely inform them. Yet persuasion itself eventually creates a new responsibility. Once a leader successfully wins the hearts and minds of an audience, expectations begin to change. People no longer view that individual as merely a speaker. They begin viewing that individual as a leader whose words carry lasting consequences. Inspiration must therefore evolve into guidance, and influence must evolve into responsibility. In our next lesson, we will leave the world of public persuasion and enter the long-term reality of executive leadership, where language becomes the instrument through which vision is maintained, teams are guided, and constructive feedback shapes the future of an organization. As we concluded our previous lesson, we reached the point where persuasion had accomplished its purpose. The vision had been communicated, the audience had been inspired, and the speaker had successfully won attention, trust, and enthusiasm. Yet every experienced leader eventually discovers a profound truth. Inspiring people for a moment is far easier than guiding them over months and years. Once the applause fades and the audience returns to work, leadership begins. This is the stage where rhetoric must evolve into responsibility, where influence becomes accountability, and where language transforms into the primary instrument through which organizations are guided toward their goals. I remember meeting a chief executive officer in New York who had built a reputation as a remarkable public speaker. Employees admired him, investors trusted him, and journalists frequently quoted his speeches. Yet during a private conversation, he confessed something unexpected. He told me that delivering an inspiring keynote address was often the easiest part of his job. The real challenge emerged afterward, when he needed to translate broad ideas into daily actions, difficult decisions, and measurable outcomes. That conversation stayed with me because it perfectly illustrated the distinction between persuasion and leadership. One creates momentum, while the other sustains it. The language of leadership differs significantly from the language of public influence. Persuasion often focuses on possibility, while leadership focuses on execution. A persuasive speaker may describe a compelling future, but a leader must explain how individuals contribute to achieving that future. This requires clarity, consistency, and strategic communication. Employees need to understand not only where the organization is going, but also why their specific efforts matter. Without that connection, even the most inspiring vision risks becoming little more than an attractive slogan. One of the most important responsibilities of leadership communication involves articulating vision. In my experience, many managers mistakenly assume that a vision statement speaks for itself. They announce a strategic objective and expect everyone to interpret it in the same way. Reality rarely works that way. Human beings naturally filter information through personal experiences, assumptions, and priorities. Effective leaders therefore repeat, clarify, and reinforce their vision continuously. They communicate it through meetings, decisions, stories, and everyday conversations until it becomes part of the organization's culture. I often compare organizational vision to a lighthouse standing on a distant shoreline. During calm weather, people may not pay much attention to it. Yet during uncertainty, confusion, or change, that lighthouse becomes essential. Employees need a reliable point of reference that helps them understand priorities and direction. Skilled leaders use language to maintain that reference point. They connect daily tasks to long-term objectives, ensuring that individuals understand how their contributions support the broader mission. Another crucial aspect of executive communication involves delegation. Many professionals associate delegation with simply assigning tasks, but effective delegation is far more sophisticated. True delegation transfers not only responsibility, but also ownership. It communicates trust, confidence, and expectations simultaneously. Poor delegation creates confusion because instructions remain vague or incomplete. Effective delegation creates empowerment because individuals understand both the objective and the significance of their role in achieving it. I once worked with a talented executive who struggled with delegation despite possessing exceptional technical expertise. Whenever projects became important, he instinctively tried to manage every detail personally. As a result, his team became increasingly dependent on him and organizational growth slowed. During our coaching sessions, we focused heavily on language. Instead of saying, "Complete this task exactly as instructed," He learned to say, "I trust your judgment on implementation, and I would like you to take ownership of achieving this outcome." The change appeared subtle, yet the impact was extraordinary. The phrase, "I trust your judgment," carries immense power in leadership contexts. Trust functions as both a practical and psychological resource. When leaders communicate trust sincerely, they encourage initiative, creativity, and accountability. Employees become more willing to solve problems independently because they feel respected rather than controlled. Of course, trust does not eliminate accountability. Effective leaders balance autonomy with clear expectations. They define objectives while allowing flexibility regarding methods whenever appropriate. Vocabulary associated with delegation often reflects this balance. Expressions such as take ownership, exercise your discretion, lead this initiative, assume responsibility, and drive this project forward communicate confidence and empowerment. Compare these phrases with more controlling alternatives such as follow instructions carefully or wait for approval before proceeding. The difference extends beyond wording. It reflects fundamentally different leadership philosophies. One encourages dependence, while the other encourages growth. Growth itself brings us to another essential leadership skill, the delivery of constructive feedback. Throughout my teaching career, I have observed that feedback conversations often generate anxiety for both leaders and employees. Leaders worry about damaging morale. Employees worry about criticism. Yet organizations cannot improve without honest evaluation. The challenge lies in communicating weaknesses in ways that encourage development rather than defensiveness. This is where the growth mindset framework becomes invaluable. The growth mindset rests upon a simple, yet transformative principle. Abilities are not fixed. Performance can improve through effort, learning, and adaptation. Consequently, effective feedback focuses on behaviors, processes, and outcomes rather than personal identity. Consider the difference between saying, "You're not a strong presenter," and saying, "Your presentation would become significantly more effective with clearer transitions and stronger audience engagement." The first statement attacks identity. The second identifies opportunities for improvement. One expression I frequently teach is, "While I commend your initiative, the execution fell short of our benchmark in several key metrics." This sentence demonstrates several important leadership techniques simultaneously. It begins by acknowledging effort, which preserves dignity and motivation. It then identifies a performance gap using objective language rather than personal criticism. Finally, it references measurable standards rather than subjective opinions. Such phrasing allows leaders to address problems directly while maintaining respect. I remember coaching a department director who avoided difficult conversations because she feared hurting people's feelings. Unfortunately, her reluctance created larger problems over time. Employees remained unaware of performance issues, mistakes repeated themselves, and frustration quietly accumulated. Together, we practiced feedback language that balanced honesty with encouragement. Instead of saying, "This project was disappointing," she learned to say, "Several aspects of this project demonstrated promise, and I believe future iterations could achieve significantly stronger results if we address these specific challenges." The message remained honest, yet the tone encouraged improvement. Psychology plays a central role in successful feedback conversations. Human beings naturally protect their self-esteem. When criticism feels like a personal attack, defensive reactions often emerge automatically. Effective leaders therefore frame feedback around growth rather than judgment. They emphasize future potential rather than past failure. Expressions such as moving forward, building upon your strengths, developing this capability, and expanding your effectiveness direct attention toward progress rather than blame. Another valuable leadership skill involves recognizing achievement. Interestingly, many managers assume that employees primarily require corrective feedback. While improvement is certainly important, recognition plays an equally critical role in sustaining motivation. People want to know that their efforts matter. Genuine recognition strengthens engagement, reinforces desirable behaviors, and contributes to organizational culture. However, effective recognition must remain specific. Generic praise often feels insincere because it lacks detail and credibility. I once observed a senior executive congratulate an employee by saying, "Great job." The employee smiled politely, yet the interaction quickly ended. A few minutes later, another executive approached the same employee and said, "Your ability to anticipate customer concerns during that presentation significantly strengthened our credibility." The second compliment produced a much stronger response because it identified a specific behavior and explained its impact. Meaningful recognition helps people understand exactly what they're doing well. Communication also becomes especially important during periods of organizational change. New strategies, restructuring efforts, technological transitions, and market shifts often generate uncertainty. During such moments, employees look toward leaders for reassurance and direction. Ambiguity can create anxiety if left unaddressed. Effective leaders therefore communicate frequently, transparently, and consistently. They acknowledge challenges honestly while reinforcing confidence in the organization's ability to adapt successfully. One phrase I frequently recommend during change management discussions is, "While the path ahead may present challenges, we possess the capability and resources necessary to navigate them successfully." This statement acknowledges reality without encouraging fear. It demonstrates confidence without denying complexity. Such balance is essential because credibility depends upon both honesty and optimism. Excessive positivity may appear disconnected from reality, while excessive negativity can undermine morale. As organizations grow, leaders inevitably encounter situations involving conflict, competing priorities, and difficult decisions. In these moments, language serves not merely as a communication tool, but as a stabilizing force. Clear expectations reduce confusion. Constructive feedback promotes improvement. Meaningful recognition sustains motivation. Strategic delegation develops future leaders. A well-articulated vision provides direction. Together, these elements create an environment in which individuals understand both their responsibilities and their potential. The most effective leaders I have met share a common characteristic. They understand that communication is not an occasional activity reserved for major announcements. It is a continuous process woven into every interaction. Every conversation reinforces culture. Every decision communicates values. Every piece of feedback influences behavior. Leadership, therefore, exists not only in grand speeches, but also in everyday language choices that shape how people think, feel, and act. As our lesson approaches its conclusion, I want you to recognize that executive communication represents the bridge between aspiration and achievement. Vision provides direction, delegation distributes responsibility, recognition reinforces excellence, and feedback accelerates growth. These skills allow leaders to transform groups of individuals into coordinated organizations capable of accomplishing remarkable goals. Mastering this language requires empathy, clarity, discipline, and consistency, qualities that distinguish truly effective leaders from merely competent managers. Yet even the most successful organization eventually encounters circumstances beyond its control. Markets fluctuate, competitors emerge, technologies evolve, and unexpected crises disrupt carefully constructed plans. No amount of leadership can eliminate uncertainty entirely. Consequently, the next phase of our journey begins after a brief pause for reflection. Following a 5-minute mid-session intermission, We will enter the high-pressure world of crisis management and damage control, where leaders must communicate with precision, accountability, and calm determination while guiding their organizations through moments of extraordinary challenge. As we concluded our previous lesson, we left the world of executive leadership standing on seemingly stable ground. A compelling vision had been communicated, responsibilities had been delegated, feedback systems had been established, and organizational culture appeared strong. Yet every experienced leader eventually discovers a reality that no business school, management seminar, or leadership handbook can fully prepare them for. No organization, regardless of its competence, remains untouched by disruption forever. Markets shift unexpectedly, technologies evolve overnight, competitors emerge from nowhere, and human error inevitably finds its way into even the most carefully designed systems. It is at this precise moment, when confidence collides with uncertainty, that the language of crisis communication becomes one of the most valuable skills a leader can possess. I learned this lesson during a consulting engagement that remains vivid in my memory years later. A respected company had spent decades building trust with customers, investors, and employees. Its reputation appeared nearly untouchable. Then a seemingly minor operational oversight triggered a chain reaction of failures that quickly became public. Within hours, journalists were requesting statements, customers were expressing outrage online, and employees were desperately seeking guidance from management. What fascinated me was not merely the crisis itself. Rather, it was how quickly language became the central battlefield. Every sentence issued by leadership influenced public perception, employee morale, and future recovery. In moments of crisis, many inexperienced leaders make a dangerous mistake. They assume that silence buys time. In reality, silence often creates a vacuum that becomes filled with speculation, fear, and misinformation. Human beings naturally seek explanations when uncertainty emerges. If leaders fail to provide those explanations, others will create them. This is why effective crisis communication begins with acknowledgement rather than avoidance. The goal is not to possess every answer immediately. The goal is to demonstrate awareness, responsibility, and engagement. One of the most powerful expressions in crisis communication is, "We take absolute ownership of this oversight." The phrase may appear simple, yet its impact is profound. Notice that it avoids excuses, blame shifting, and defensive language. It communicates accountability directly. Throughout my career, I have observed that audiences often forgive mistakes more readily than they forgive evasion. People understand that errors occur. What they find difficult to accept is the perception that leaders are unwilling to accept responsibility. The vocabulary of accountability, therefore, occupies a central position in advanced communication. Words such as ownership, responsibility, accountability, transparency, acknowledgement, commitment, and resolution carry significant weight during difficult situations. Compare the statement, "Mistakes were made," with the statement, "We accept full responsibility for this failure." The first sounds detached and passive. The second sounds active and accountable. Although both reference the same event, the emotional impact differs dramatically because accountability creates trust while ambiguity often creates suspicion. I remember analyzing several public statements with my executive students after major corporate controversies had dominated news cycles. Again and again, we noticed a recurring pattern. Organizations that recovered most effectively were not necessarily those that avoided mistakes. Rather, they were the organizations that communicated with honesty and clarity once mistakes became apparent. Their leaders acknowledged reality quickly, outlined corrective actions, and maintained consistent communication throughout the recovery process. Trust, we discovered, was often rebuilt one carefully chosen sentence at a time. Another critical concept in crisis communication is mitigation. While accountability addresses the past, mitigation focuses on the present and future. Stakeholders naturally want to know what leaders are doing to reduce damage and prevent escalation. Consequently, crisis language frequently includes terms such as containment, corrective action, remediation, safeguard, mitigation strategy, and risk reduction. These expressions signal movement. They reassure audiences that leadership is not merely observing the situation, but actively addressing it. One phrase I frequently teach is, "We are actively implementing robust corrective measures to preclude any recurrence." This sentence contains several useful linguistic features. The word actively communicates urgency and engagement. The adjective robust conveys strength and seriousness. Corrective measures emphasize solutions rather than excuses. Finally, the phrase preclude any recurrence directs attention toward prevention rather than damage alone. Collectively, these elements create a message of competence and determination. Psychology plays an enormous role in how audiences interpret crisis communication. During periods of uncertainty, people become highly sensitive to signals of confidence, honesty, and stability. They look for evidence that leaders understand the seriousness of the situation. Excessive optimism may appear disconnected from reality, while excessive pessimism can intensify fear. Effective communicators therefore balance realism with reassurance. They acknowledge challenges honestly, while reinforcing confidence in the organization's ability to navigate them successfully. I once coached a senior executive whose company experienced a significant data security incident. Initially, he wanted to reassure customers by saying, "Everything is under control." While the intention was positive, the statement created problems because available facts did not support such certainty. We instead developed a more credible message. He stated, "We recognize the seriousness of this issue. We are conducting a comprehensive investigation, and we are dedicating all necessary resources toward resolving it as quickly as possible." The revised statement inspired greater trust because it balanced confidence with transparency. Transparency itself deserves special attention. Many leaders fear transparency because they associate it with vulnerability. Yet, transparency does not require revealing every internal detail. Rather, it involves communicating honestly about what is known, what remains unknown, and what actions are being taken. Phrases such as, "Based on the information currently available," "Our investigation remains ongoing," and "We will continue providing updates as new information emerges," help maintain credibility while acknowledging uncertainty. Another valuable communication skill during crises involves managing stakeholder emotions. Different groups often experience the same event differently. Customers may feel frustrated, employees may feel anxious, investors may feel concerned, and partners may feel uncertain. Effective leaders recognize these emotional realities and address them directly. Language that ignores emotional responses often appears cold or disconnected. Conversely, language that acknowledges concerns demonstrates empathy and strengthens relationships. I often encourage my students to incorporate phrases such as, "We understand the concerns this situation has created," or "We recognize the frustration experienced by those affected." These expressions may seem straightforward, yet they serve an important purpose. They communicate awareness of human consequences rather than focusing exclusively on technical details. Empathy, when expressed sincerely, can significantly improve how messages are received during difficult circumstances. One memorable example occurred during a manufacturing disruption that affected thousands of customers. Several executives initially focused entirely on logistical explanations and operational metrics. While technically accurate, their communication felt impersonal. Eventually, leadership shifted its approach. Public statements began acknowledging customer inconvenience and expressing genuine regret. The operational facts remained important, but empathy added a human dimension that had previously been missing. Public response improved noticeably because people felt heard rather than dismissed. Crisis communication also requires consistency. Contradictory messages create confusion and undermine credibility. When different representatives offer conflicting explanations, audiences may begin questioning whether leadership truly understands the situation. For this reason, successful organizations often establish clear communication frameworks during crises. Key messages remain aligned across departments, ensuring that stakeholders receive coherent information regardless of the source. I frequently compare crisis communication to navigating a ship through a storm. During calm weather, minor differences in direction may seem insignificant. During a storm, however, even small navigational errors can have serious consequences. Similarly, inconsistent communication that might be overlooked during ordinary circumstances can become highly damaging during periods of uncertainty. Precision becomes essential because every message influences perception. Another advanced aspect of crisis communication involves preserving long-term reputation while addressing immediate problems. Inexperienced communicators sometimes focus exclusively on short-term image protection. They attempt to minimize damage through denial, deflection, or selective disclosure. While such strategies may occasionally provide temporary relief, they often create greater problems later. Sustainable reputation management depends upon credibility, and credibility depends upon honesty. Effective leaders therefore prioritize truth over convenience. Throughout my years as an educator, I have consistently observed that audiences are remarkably perceptive. They may not possess access to every detail, but they often recognize sincerity when they encounter it. They can distinguish between genuine accountability and carefully disguised avoidance. This is why authentic communication remains one of the most powerful tools available to leaders during difficult moments. Authenticity builds trust, and trust accelerates recovery. As the immediate crisis begins to stabilize, communication priorities gradually evolve. External audiences require updates, reassurance, and evidence of progress. Internally, however, another challenge begins to emerge. Employees who worked through the crisis may experience exhaustion, frustration, or uncertainty. Hidden tensions may develop between departments. Disagreements regarding decisions may remain unresolved. Although the public emergency appears contained, subtle internal dynamics continue influencing organizational health. This transition marks an important turning point in our broader journey through advanced communication. Crisis management teaches us how to address visible problems under intense pressure. Yet leadership extends beyond public statements and external reassurance. Once the flames of crisis have been extinguished, leaders must examine what remains beneath the surface. They must recognize concerns that are not openly expressed, resistance that appears indirectly, and political dynamics that influence behavior quietly but powerfully. As we conclude this lesson, I want you to remember that crisis communication is ultimately about trust. Accountability establishes trust. Transparency sustains trust. Empathy strengthens trust, and corrective action restores trust. The vocabulary of crisis management is not merely a collection of professional phrases. It is a framework for guiding people through uncertainty with honesty and competence. Mastering this language enables leaders to remain credible even when circumstances become extraordinarily difficult. Yet the story does not end when public confidence begins to recover. In many ways, the most complex communication challenges emerge afterward, hidden within ordinary conversations, subtle reactions, and unspoken assumptions. Therefore, in our next lesson, we will shift our attention inward. Having navigated external crises successfully, we will explore the sophisticated art of reading between the lines, decoding subtext, recognizing subtle resistance, understanding professional sarcasm, and uncovering the invisible currents that shape communication within teams and organizations. As we concluded our previous lesson, the public crisis had largely subsided. Statements had been issued, corrective actions had been implemented, and external stakeholders had gradually regained confidence. Yet, as I have learned throughout my years teaching executives, diplomats, and high-level professionals, the most challenging communication problems are not always the ones that appear in public. Some of the most consequential conversations occur beneath the surface, hidden within carefully chosen words, subtle expressions, unfinished sentences, and seemingly harmless remarks. Once a leader successfully navigates a visible crisis, attention must shift inward toward the invisible dynamics shaping relationships, trust, and influence. It is here that we enter one of the most fascinating aspects of advanced English communication, the world of subtext, irony, implication, and the language that native speakers often communicate without explicitly saying. I remember attending a strategy meeting in San Francisco several years ago, where a group of executives were discussing a proposed initiative. One participant presented an idea enthusiastically, describing its potential benefits in great detail. When he finished speaking, another executive leaned back at her chair and calmly replied, "That's certainly an interesting idea." The room became strangely quiet. To a non-native speaker, the statement might have sounded encouraging. Yet every native speaker present immediately understood something very different. The phrase did not mean enthusiastic approval. In that particular context, it often translated psychologically into something closer to, "I have serious reservations about this proposal, but I am expressing them indirectly." That moment perfectly illustrates the concept of high-context communication. In low-context communication, meaning exists primarily within the words themselves. In high-context communication, however, meaning emerges from a combination of words, tone, facial expression, social dynamics, and cultural expectations. Native speakers frequently rely on these additional layers because they allow criticism, skepticism, or disagreement to be communicated without direct confrontation. Understanding these hidden layers represents a major milestone in advanced English mastery. One reason subtext develops so naturally among native speakers is that human beings constantly balance honesty with social harmony. People do not always wish to express every thought explicitly. They may want to preserve relationships, avoid embarrassment, or create room for negotiation. As a result, language evolves to include phrases whose true meaning depends heavily upon context. A sentence that appears positive on the surface may actually signal concern, skepticism, or rejection underneath. Learning to recognize these signals requires observation, cultural awareness, and emotional intelligence. Consider several common examples. If a manager says, "That's an ambitious timeline," the literal meaning concerns scheduling. Yet the underlying message may be, "This deadline is probably unrealistic." If a colleague says, "That's one way of looking at it," the statement may quietly communicate disagreement. If someone remarks, "You certainly approach the problem creatively," the speaker may genuinely admire innovation, or they may be politely questioning the wisdom of the chosen approach. The words themselves provide only part of the message. Interpretation depends upon context. Throughout my teaching career, I have encouraged students to pay close attention not merely to vocabulary, but also to conversational patterns. Native speakers often soften criticism by replacing direct statements with indirect observations. Instead of saying, "This will fail," they might say, "I wonder whether we have fully considered the potential challenges." Instead of declaring, "I disagree," they might respond. That raises an interesting question. The objective is not deception. Rather, it is the preservation of constructive dialogue. Sophisticated communicators understand that how something is said can be just as important as what is said. One particularly fascinating aspect of subtext involves corporate irony. Irony occurs when the intended meaning differs from the literal wording. In professional environments, irony is often subtle rather than dramatic. I once observed a project manager reviewing a presentation that contained numerous errors. After examining the document, he smiled slightly and said, "Well, this should certainly keep us busy." Everyone in the room immediately recognized the irony. The sentence did not express enthusiasm. It communicated concern while reducing tension through humor. Professional irony serves several functions. It allows dissatisfaction to be expressed without open hostility. It can reduce conflict by introducing humor into difficult situations. It can also create solidarity among team members who share an understanding of the underlying message. However, irony requires caution because it depends heavily on shared cultural knowledge. Non-native speakers may misinterpret it entirely, assuming literal meanings where none were intended. This is why advanced listening skills become so important at higher levels of communication. I remember coaching an international executive who frequently attended meetings in New York. His English grammar was exceptional, and his vocabulary was extensive. Yet he often felt confused by reactions during discussions. After reviewing several recorded meetings together, we discovered that the challenge was not language accuracy. It was subtext. Colleagues were communicating concerns indirectly, and he was interpreting their statements literally. Once he learned to recognize patterns of hesitation, understatement, and implied meaning, his understanding improved dramatically. Another useful skill involves recognizing linguistic signals that suggest hidden disagreement. Phrases such as, "I'm not entirely convinced," "I see where you're coming from," "That's an interesting perspective," and "there may be another way to approach this," frequently function as diplomatic indicators of opposition. Notice that none of these expressions explicitly reject an idea. Yet each introduces distance between the speaker and the proposal under discussion. Advanced communicators learn to identify these signals quickly because they often reveal more than direct statements. Psychology plays a significant role in this process. Human beings rarely communicate purely through logic. Emotions, social expectations, and interpersonal relationships constantly influence language choices. When people feel uncomfortable expressing disagreement openly, they often rely on implication instead. The result is a rich landscape of hidden meaning that exists beneath ordinary conversation. Understanding this landscape allows communicators to respond more effectively because they recognize concerns before those concerns become explicit conflicts. I often compare subtext to currents beneath the surface of an ocean. From above, the water may appear calm and predictable. Beneath the surface, however, powerful forces influence movement and direction. Conversations operate in much the same way. The spoken words represent only the visible layer. Underneath exist assumptions, emotions, loyalties, fears, ambitions, and unspoken opinions. Effective communicators pay attention to both levels simultaneously. One valuable technique for interpreting subtext involves observing inconsistency between language and behavior. Imagine a colleague saying, "I completely support the initiative," while avoiding participation in discussions and delaying implementation efforts. The verbal message appears positive, but the behavioral message suggests resistance. Skilled communicators recognize that actions often reveal information unavailable through language alone. They evaluate communication holistically rather than relying exclusively on spoken words. At the same time, understanding subtext also improves speaking ability. Once communicators recognize indirect patterns, they can use them strategically. Professional wit provides an excellent example. Wit differs from sarcasm because its purpose is not humiliation. Instead, it introduces intelligence, humor, and subtle observation into conversation. A carefully timed witty remark can ease tension, build rapport, and communicate dissatisfaction without damaging relationships. I once attended a negotiation where discussions had become increasingly tense. After several hours of disagreement, one participant smiled and said, "At this rate, we may eventually discover a solution acceptable to both parties and future generations." The room erupted in laughter. The comment gently acknowledged the slow pace of progress without attacking anyone personally. More importantly, it reduced emotional tension and allowed constructive discussion to continue. This illustrates the power of professional wit when used appropriately. Cultural awareness becomes especially important in this area because communication styles vary significantly across societies. Some cultures value directness and transparency. Others prioritize harmony and indirect communication. American professional culture often occupies an interesting middle ground. Direct communication is generally respected, yet excessive bluntness may still be perceived negatively. Consequently, American professionals frequently employ a combination of clarity and subtlety. Understanding this balance helps advanced learners navigate interactions more effectively. Another common feature of high-level communication involves understatement. Native speakers sometimes deliberately describe significant issues using surprisingly mild language. For example, a company experiencing major operational difficulties might describe the situation as a bit challenging. A leader confronting substantial resistance may refer to a few concerns that need to be addressed. Such understatement often signals the opposite of what the literal words suggest. The smaller the description appears, the greater the underlying issue may actually be. I have found that learners often experience a breakthrough when they stop listening exclusively for explicit information and begin listening for intention. Instead of asking, "What did the speaker say?" they ask, "What does the speaker want me to understand?" This shift transforms comprehension. Suddenly, conversations become richer, more nuanced, and more predictable. Hidden meanings become easier to identify because attention focuses on purpose rather than vocabulary alone. As communicators develop this skill, they also become more sensitive to their own language choices. They learn when directness is appropriate and when subtlety serves a better purpose. They recognize situations where humor may diffuse tension and situations where clarity must take priority. Most importantly, they become capable of navigating complex interpersonal dynamics without creating unnecessary conflict. This ability distinguishes highly sophisticated communicators from merely fluent speakers. By this stage in our journey, we have explored diplomacy, debate, negotiation, persuasion, leadership, and crisis management. Each lesson has revealed another layer of human communication. Yet perhaps none has demonstrated the psychological complexity of language more clearly than subtext. The realization that words often carry meanings beyond their literal definitions changes how we listen, how we speak, and how we understand others. Communication ceases to be a simple exchange of information and becomes an intricate system of signals, intentions, and relationships. As we conclude this lesson, I want you to remember that mastery of advanced English requires more than grammatical accuracy. It requires sensitivity to context, culture, emotion, and implication. Understanding when "that's an interesting idea" actually means that will never work is not merely a linguistic skill. It is a form of social intelligence. The ability to recognize irony, decode hidden messages, and employ subtle wit allows communicators to operate effectively within sophisticated professional environments. Yet the journey continues. Once a speaker develops a deep understanding of human psychology and subtext, an entirely new world opens before them. Communication becomes less about transactions and more about relationships. The boardroom gradually gives way to the dinner table, the networking event, and the intellectual salon. In our next lesson, we will move beyond corporate communication and explore the art of elite socializing, sophisticated conversation, and contemporary intellectual discourse, where language becomes the bridge connecting ambitious individuals across cultures, professions, and ideas. As we concluded our previous lesson, we arrived at a deeper understanding of subtext, irony, implication, and the invisible currents that flow beneath ordinary conversation. We discovered that truly advanced communication involves far more than vocabulary and grammar. It requires the ability to recognize intentions hidden behind words, emotions concealed beneath politeness, and meanings that exist between sentences rather than within them. Yet once a communicator becomes comfortable navigating these subtle dimensions, a new opportunity emerges. Communication is no longer limited to solving problems, managing organizations, or avoiding misunderstandings. It becomes a gateway into sophisticated human connection, intellectual exploration, and the art of engaging with remarkable people through meaningful conversation. I remember attending a private networking reception in Boston several years ago where successful entrepreneurs, professors, investors, artists, and policy analysts gathered for an evening discussion. Before entering the event, I expected to hear the familiar conversational patterns that dominate many social situations. I assumed people would ask predictable questions, exchange routine pleasantries, and discuss superficial topics. Instead, I encountered something entirely different. Within minutes of arriving, I overheard a discussion regarding demographic shifts and their long-term influence on economic productivity. Nearby, two guests were debating whether technological innovation inevitably strengthens democracy or gradually concentrates power. The atmosphere felt intellectually alive. That evening fundamentally changed the way I thought about social communication. Many language learners mistakenly believe that advanced English exists primarily in business meetings, academic conferences, or political debates. In reality, some of the most sophisticated communication occurs during informal social interactions. Highly educated and intellectually curious individuals often use casual settings as opportunities to exchange ideas, test perspectives, and explore concepts that extend far beyond immediate practical concerns. Social conversation becomes a form of intellectual play rather than a simple exchange of information. One of the first habits I encourage my students to abandon is the automatic reliance on predictable small talk. Questions such as, "How are you?" followed by the equally predictable response, "I'm fine," rarely create memorable conversations. While these expressions certainly have their place, they seldom lead to meaningful intellectual engagement. Sophisticated communicators often replace routine questions with observations, perspectives, or thought-provoking inquiries. Instead of asking, "How has your week been?" they may ask, "What development in your field has surprised you most recently?" Such questions invite reflection rather than routine responses. The difference may appear minor, yet its effects are remarkable. Human beings generally enjoy discussing ideas that stimulate curiosity. When conversations move beyond predictable scripts, people become more engaged, expressive, and authentic. They reveal not only what they know, but also how they think. This distinction is crucial because meaningful relationships are often built through shared perspectives rather than shared facts. Ideas create connections that ordinary pleasantries rarely achieve. I once met an economist at a dinner event who transformed an entire table's conversation with a single question. Rather than discussing the weather or recent travel experiences, he asked, Do you believe economic growth and human happiness are necessarily connected? Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Guests who had previously contributed little began sharing opinions, experiences, and observations. The conversation expanded into psychology, public policy, cultural values, and personal fulfillment. By the end of the evening, strangers had become intellectually connected through a shared exploration of ideas. This illustrates one of the most important principles of elite social communication. Interesting conversations rarely begin with interesting answers. They begin with interesting questions. Questions act as intellectual invitations. They encourage others to participate in a collaborative process of discovery. Skilled conversationalists therefore invest significant effort in developing thoughtful questions that stimulate reflection rather than merely requesting information. They understand that curiosity often generates stronger connections than expertise alone. Another valuable area of advanced conversation involves macroeconomics. At first glance, economics may seem too technical for social discussion. Yet, economic topics influence nearly every aspect of modern life, from housing affordability and employment opportunities to technological development and international trade. Consequently, economics provides an excellent source of intellectually stimulating conversation. Expressions such as fiscal policy, market incentives, productivity growth, inflationary pressure, economic resilience, and structural reform frequently appear in discussions among educated professionals. What matters most, however, is not memorizing terminology. Rather, it is learning how to transform economic concepts into engaging dialogue. Instead of presenting facts mechanically, skilled speakers connect them to broader human questions. A conversation about inflation may evolve into a discussion regarding social stability. A debate about automation may lead to reflections on the future of work. Economic topics become fascinating when linked to their human consequences. Geopolitics offers another rich source of sophisticated conversation. Throughout my years teaching international professionals, I noticed that many accomplished individuals enjoy discussing the forces shaping the global landscape. Topics such as shifting alliances, technological competition, energy security, demographic change, and international cooperation frequently emerge during social gatherings. These discussions require careful language because geopolitical subjects often involve complexity, uncertainty, and differing perspectives. Consequently, expressions such as strategic interests, geopolitical influence, regional stability, diplomatic engagement, and emerging power structures become particularly useful. I remember attending a conference reception in Washington where a seemingly casual discussion regarding supply chains gradually evolved into a broader conversation about national security, technological sovereignty, and global interdependence. What impressed me was not the participants' knowledge alone. It was their ability to explore disagreement respectfully. They treated conversation not as competition but as collective inquiry. This mindset transformed potentially divisive topics into opportunities for learning. Philosophy occupies a unique place within advanced social communication because it encourages people to examine assumptions they rarely question. Philosophical discussions often begin with deceptively simple questions. What constitutes a meaningful life? Is freedom more important than security? Can technological progress substitute for wisdom? Such questions possess no universally accepted answers, which makes them ideal conversation topics. Participants contribute perspectives rather than definitive conclusions, creating an atmosphere of exploration rather than argument. I often encourage learners to become comfortable with phrases such as one interpretation might be, I tend to view that issue through the lens of, and perhaps a more interesting question is. These expressions help maintain openness during philosophical discussions. They signal curiosity rather than certainty. Intellectual humility becomes especially valuable because philosophical conversations often involve ideas that reasonable people can interpret differently. Art provides another powerful pathway into meaningful dialogue. Many individuals mistakenly assume that discussing art requires specialized expertise. In reality, art conversations often focus less on technical analysis and more on interpretation. A painting, novel, film, or piece of music becomes a catalyst for exploring emotion, culture, identity, and meaning. Questions such as, what do you think the artist was attempting to communicate? Or, why do you think this work resonates with so many people? Invite participation regardless of formal training. One evening, I attended a gallery exhibition where two guests spent nearly an hour discussing a single painting. Their conversation moved effortlessly between aesthetics, history, psychology, and personal memory. Neither individual was attempting to demonstrate superiority. They were simply exploring ideas together. That experience reminded me that intellectual conversation thrives when participants seek understanding rather than validation. Vocabulary plays an important role in these environments because precise language enables precise thinking. Words such as nuance, paradigm, perspective, implication, framework, assumption, complexity, ambiguity, and interpretation frequently appear in elevated conversations. These terms allow speakers to discuss abstract ideas with greater accuracy. More importantly, they encourage analytical thinking. The language we possess often shapes the thoughts we can articulate. Yet, vocabulary alone is not enough. Listening remains equally important. Many people enter conversations hoping to impress others with their knowledge. Sophisticated communicators often adopt the opposite approach. They listen carefully, identify interesting ideas, and build upon them. This creates a collaborative dynamic in which conversation becomes a shared intellectual journey rather than a competition for attention. Genuine curiosity frequently proves more attractive than expertise alone. Psychologically, this approach works because people appreciate feeling understood. When individuals sense that their ideas are being considered thoughtfully, they become more willing to engage deeply. The conversation gains momentum. New perspectives emerge. Trust develops naturally. Intellectual connection gradually evolves into personal connection. This process explains why meaningful discussions often create stronger relationships than years of superficial interaction. I have noticed that some of the most memorable conversationalists possess a remarkable ability to connect seemingly unrelated topics. A discussion about architecture may transition into psychology. A conversation about technology may lead to ethics. A debate regarding economics may evolve into philosophy. These transitions create richness because they reveal the interconnected nature of human knowledge. Sophisticated communication often thrives at the intersections between disciplines rather than within isolated categories. Another characteristic of elite social environments is comfort with uncertainty. Participants do not feel obligated to possess definitive answers. They are willing to explore possibilities, reconsider assumptions, and revise opinions when presented with new evidence. Expressions such as, "I haven't considered it from that perspective," or "that's a compelling argument," signal intellectual maturity. They demonstrate confidence without rigidity and curiosity without insecurity. As communicators develop these habits, social interactions become increasingly rewarding. Conversations cease to revolve around predictable routines and begin generating genuine insight. People become sources of ideas rather than merely sources of information. Every interaction offers an opportunity to learn something unexpected. This mindset transforms networking from a transactional activity into an enriching intellectual experience. By this stage in our broader journey, we have moved far beyond the mechanics of language. We have explored diplomacy, debate, negotiation, persuasion, leadership, crisis communication, and subtext. Each lesson has expanded our understanding of how language shapes relationships and influences perception. Now, through sophisticated social discourse, we see language functioning as a bridge between minds, cultures, disciplines, and experiences. As we conclude this lesson, I want you to remember that advanced communication is not measured solely by grammatical accuracy or vocabulary size. It is measured by the quality of conversations you are capable of creating. The ability to transform casual encounters into intellectually stimulating exchanges represents a powerful social skill. Through thoughtful questions, precise language, genuine curiosity, and openness to complexity, communicators create interactions that people remember long after they end. Yet, even the richest discussions about economics, geopolitics, philosophy, and art remain connected to the tangible world. Eventually, conversation moves beyond external topics and enters a deeper territory. Human beings begin exploring identity, purpose, meaning, belief, and the abstract concepts that shape existence itself. To navigate that realm effectively requires a new linguistic ability, the capacity to articulate ideas that cannot be seen, touched, or easily defined. In our next lesson, we will therefore move beyond worldly subjects and enter the fascinating challenge of expressing abstract thought and philosophical insight with clarity, elegance, and precision. As we concluded our previous lesson, we arrived at a fascinating threshold in the development of advanced communication. We had already moved beyond diplomacy, debate, negotiation, leadership, crisis management, subtext, and intellectual conversation. We had learned how language could influence organizations, shape relationships, and facilitate sophisticated social interaction. Yet despite all of these achievements, one challenge remained. The most difficult ideas human beings encounter are rarely economic, political, or professional. They are philosophical. They concern identity, meaning, purpose, morality, freedom, consciousness, and the countless invisible forces that shape our experience of existence. To discuss such ideas effectively, a communicator must develop the ability to transform vague and intangible thoughts into language that feels precise, elegant, and persuasive. I remember sitting in a quiet bookstore cafe in Seattle many years ago, listening to two professors engaged in a conversation that seemed almost magical. They were discussing the concept of progress. One argued that humanity was advancing rapidly through technology, while the other questioned whether technological advancement necessarily represented genuine progress. What fascinated me was not merely the topic itself. It was the language they used. Their ideas were abstract, yet their words gave those abstractions shape. They transformed invisible concepts into vivid intellectual landscapes that listeners could explore. That afternoon taught me an important lesson. Advanced communication is not simply the ability to understand complex ideas. It is the ability to make those ideas understandable to others. Many language learners discover that discussing concrete subjects feels relatively straightforward. It is usually easy to describe a building, explain a business strategy, or discuss a current event. Difficulties arise when the conversation shifts toward concepts that cannot be observed directly. How does one describe hope, meaning, destiny, justice, or wisdom? These words represent realities that cannot be measured physically, yet they occupy a central place within human thought. The challenge lies in constructing language that captures their complexity without becoming vague or confusing. One of the most powerful tools available for this purpose is advanced grammatical structure. Grammar at the highest levels of English is not merely a system of rules. It becomes an instrument for expressing subtle shades of meaning. Consider the past subjunctive. When we say, "If I were in your position," we are not describing reality. We are entering a hypothetical space, inviting listeners to imagine alternative possibilities. The structure allows us to explore ideas beyond immediate circumstances. In philosophical discussions, such flexibility becomes invaluable because abstract reasoning often depends upon imagined scenarios rather than observable facts. I frequently encourage my students to pay attention to how hypothetical language influences intellectual exploration. Imagine a discussion about personal freedom. Rather than declaring a simple opinion, a speaker might say, "If society were entirely free from regulation, individual liberty might flourish, yet social stability could become increasingly fragile." Notice how the structure creates a conceptual experiment. It encourages reflection rather than immediate judgment. Sophisticated communication often relies on this ability to construct hypothetical worlds and examine their implications carefully. Another grammatical structure that deserves special attention is the inverted conditional. Native speakers rarely use it in casual conversation, yet it appears frequently in formal writing, philosophical argumentation, and advanced public speaking. Consider the sentence, "Were it not for this paradigm shift, we would remain stagnant." The meaning resembles a standard conditional construction, yet the inversion creates a more elegant and authoritative tone. The sentence feels deliberate, thoughtful, and intellectually refined. Such structures allow abstract arguments to acquire greater rhetorical force. I remember reading a speech delivered by a prominent thinker who argued that human creativity represented civilization's greatest resource. Rather than presenting the idea directly, he wrote, "Had our ancestors accepted the limits imposed by their circumstances, countless achievements that define modern life would never have emerged." The inversion transformed a simple observation into something more memorable. It encouraged listeners to envision an alternative history while reinforcing the significance of innovation. This illustrates how grammar can amplify philosophical reasoning. Literary emphasis serves a similar function. Human beings naturally remember ideas that evoke emotion, imagery, or contrast. Abstract concepts often become more persuasive when connected to vivid language. Consider the difference between saying, "Change is important," and saying, "Change is the invisible current that carries societies either toward renewal or toward stagnation." Both statements communicate related ideas, yet the second creates a mental image. Metaphor transforms abstraction into something tangible enough for the imagination to grasp. Throughout my years as a teacher, I have observed that many learners underestimate the importance of imagery in advanced communication. They assume that intellectual discussions should remain purely analytical. In reality, some of history's most influential thinkers relied heavily on metaphor. Philosophers, political leaders, authors, and scholars frequently use symbolic language because human beings often understand complex ideas more effectively through images than through definitions. Metaphor functions as a bridge connecting abstract thought to human experience. One particularly memorable conversation occurred during a seminar on identity. A participant described personal growth by saying, "I feel as though I have spent years constructing a house without realizing I was building it on someone else's foundation." The statement was not literally true, yet it communicated a deeply personal realization with remarkable clarity. Everyone in the room immediately understood the emotional significance of the experience. This demonstrates the power of figurative language when discussing complex psychological realities. Vocabulary also plays a critical role in articulating abstract thought. Words such as paradigm, transcendence, existential, consciousness, perception, ambiguity, duality, authenticity, and impermanence allow speakers to engage with sophisticated concepts precisely. However, advanced vocabulary should never become an end in itself. Its purpose is clarity rather than decoration. The most impressive communicators are not those who use the most difficult words. They are those who select exactly the right words for the ideas they wish to express. I often encourage learners to think of vocabulary as a collection of tools rather than trophies. Possessing a tool is not the same as knowing when to use it. A speaker who inserts complicated terminology unnecessarily may appear pretentious rather than intelligent. Conversely, a speaker who employs precise language thoughtfully creates the impression of intellectual confidence. Precision is often more persuasive than complexity. The goal is not to sound sophisticated. The goal is to communicate sophisticated ideas effectively. Another hallmark of advanced philosophical communication is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. Many questions regarding human existence resist simple answers. What constitutes happiness? Is morality objective or subjective? Does history move toward progress or merely change? Reasonable individuals may disagree profoundly regarding such matters. Effective communicators therefore learn to explore uncertainty without becoming frustrated by it. They recognize that some discussions exist not to produce definitive conclusions, but to deepen understanding. This perspective changes the nature of conversation itself. Rather than treating dialogue as a contest with winners and losers, participants begin treating it as a collaborative search for insight. Expressions such as one possible interpretation, a competing perspective might suggest, and the issue becomes more complex when viewed through this lens, help maintain intellectual openness. They acknowledge uncertainty while encouraging further exploration. Such language reflects maturity because it values understanding over certainty. Psychologically, this approach is powerful because it reduces defensiveness. When individuals feel pressured to defend absolute positions, conversations often become confrontational. When they feel invited to examine possibilities, discussions become more productive. Advanced communicators therefore create environments where complexity is welcomed rather than feared. They understand that intellectual growth often begins where certainty ends. I have noticed that the most memorable thinkers frequently combine analytical precision with emotional resonance. They construct logical arguments while simultaneously acknowledging the human experiences underlying those arguments. A discussion regarding mortality, for example, may involve philosophical reasoning, yet it also touches fear, love, memory, and purpose. Language becomes most powerful when it addresses both the mind and the heart.
Pure logic informs.
Emotional insight transforms. One evening, during a university lecture, a professor concluded a discussion about time with a sentence that has remained with me ever since. He said, "Perhaps the tragedy of human life is not that time passes too quickly, but that we often realize its value only after it has already passed." The statement contained no complex terminology. Yet its impact was profound because it connected an abstract concept to universal human experience. This is the essence of powerful philosophical communication. As communicators develop these abilities, they begin expressing ideas that once seemed impossible to articulate. Thoughts that previously existed only as feelings acquire structure. Intuitions become arguments. Questions become conversations. Language evolves from a practical tool into a medium for exploring the deepest dimensions of human existence. At this stage, communication transcends information exchange and becomes a form of intellectual creation. Throughout our journey, we have repeatedly expanded the boundaries of what language can accomplish. We began with diplomacy and social nuance. We progressed through disagreement, negotiation, persuasion, leadership, crisis management, subtext, and intellectual discourse. Each lesson revealed another layer of communicative sophistication. Now, through the articulation of abstract thought, we reach one of the highest forms of linguistic mastery. We learn not merely to describe the world, but to interpret it. As this lesson draws to a close, I want you to remember that the greatest challenge in advanced communication is not learning more words or memorizing more rules. It is developing the ability to transform invisible thoughts into meaningful language. Grammar, vocabulary, metaphor, and rhetorical structure all contribute to this process. Together, they allow speakers to give form to ideas that might otherwise remain trapped within the mind. Yet an even more intriguing stage lies ahead. Once a communicator can articulate the most complex dimensions of human thought with confidence and precision, dependence upon conventional models begins to fade. Rules become tools rather than limitations. Structures become options rather than requirements. The speaker gains the freedom to shape language according to personal vision and stylistic preference. In our final lesson, we will explore the ultimate stage of mastery, the creation of an authentic personal voice, where communicators move beyond imitation and begin forging a linguistic identity that is uniquely and unmistakably their own. As we concluded our previous lesson, we arrived at what many learners mistakenly believe to be the summit of linguistic mastery. We had explored the art of articulating abstract thought, transforming elusive philosophical concepts into clear and compelling language. We had learned how advanced grammar, nuanced vocabulary, metaphorical framing, and intellectual precision could convert invisible ideas into meaningful communication. Yet, as I have discovered throughout decades of teaching ambitious professionals, scholars, entrepreneurs, and international leaders, there exists one final stage beyond technical mastery. It is a stage that cannot be reached merely through studying textbooks, memorizing vocabulary lists, or imitating native speakers. It is the stage where language ceases to be borrowed and becomes personal. It is the creation of an authentic linguistic identity. I remember a conversation with a highly accomplished international executive who spoke flawless English. His grammar was impeccable, his pronunciation was refined, and his vocabulary rivaled that of many native speakers. Yet, after delivering a presentation that impressed everyone in the room, he approached me with an unexpected concern. He confessed that despite his proficiency, he still felt as though he were performing someone else's version of English rather than expressing his own personality. His words stayed with me because they revealed an important truth. Fluency and authenticity are not necessarily the same thing. One can master a language technically while still searching for a personal voice within it. This realization introduces us to the concept of idiolect. Every individual possesses a unique linguistic fingerprint composed of preferred vocabulary, habitual sentence structures, recurring metaphors, conversational rhythms, and stylistic tendencies. Even among native speakers raised in the same culture, no two idiolects are identical. Language reflects personality, experiences, values, and worldview. Consequently, the ultimate goal of advanced communication is not perfect imitation. It is the development of a distinctive voice that communicates both competence and individuality. Throughout much of the learning process, imitation serves a valuable purpose. Beginners imitate pronunciation.
Intermediate learners imitate grammar.
Advanced learners imitate rhetorical patterns and cultural conventions. These stages are necessary because they provide structure and guidance. However, there comes a point when excessive imitation becomes a limitation rather than an advantage. If every sentence merely reproduces someone else's style, authentic self-expression remains constrained. True mastery begins when learners understand the rules well enough to adapt them according to their own communicative identity. I often compare this process to the development of a musician. A pianist initially studies scales, techniques, and classical compositions. For years, progress depends upon accurately reproducing existing works. Yet the greatest musicians eventually cultivate an unmistakable artistic voice. Their performances become recognizable not because they abandon technique, but because they integrate technique into a unique form of expression. Language follows a remarkably similar path. Technical competence provides the foundation. Personal style provides distinction. One of the most important aspects of developing an idiolect involves vocabulary selection. Advanced communicators gradually accumulate large vocabularies, yet they rarely use all available words equally. Instead, certain expressions become personal favorites. One speaker may consistently prefer analytical language, employing terms such as framework, paradigm, implication, and synthesis. Another may gravitate toward vivid imagery, frequently using metaphors and descriptive expressions. Neither approach is inherently superior. Each reflects an individual communicative identity. I remember analyzing speeches delivered by influential leaders from various fields. Although all possessed exceptional command of English, their linguistic personalities differed dramatically. Some favored concise precision. Others embraced elaborate storytelling. Some relied heavily on humor. Others cultivated an atmosphere of intellectual seriousness. Their success did not emerge from conformity. It emerged from consistency. Audiences learned to recognize their voices because those voices reflected coherent identities rather than random stylistic choices. Rhythm represents another crucial component of personal style. Many learners focus exclusively on vocabulary and grammar while overlooking pacing. Yet, pacing profoundly influences how messages are perceived. Some speakers construct long, flowing sentences that gradually build complexity and emotional momentum. Others prefer short, decisive statements that create clarity and impact. Both approaches can be effective when used intentionally. The key lies in recognizing which rhythm aligns naturally with one's communicative personality. During one seminar, I asked participants to read the same passage aloud. The results fascinated me. Although everyone used identical words, each reading felt different. Some individuals emphasized emotion. Others highlighted logic. Some created dramatic pauses. Others maintained a steady cadence. The exercise demonstrated that communication extends far beyond vocabulary alone. Delivery itself becomes an expression of identity. Even written language often reflects these rhythmic preferences through sentence length, punctuation patterns, and organizational structure. Another defining feature of an idiolect involves metaphorical habits. Human beings naturally interpret reality through recurring images and conceptual frameworks. One person may frequently describe life as a journey. Another may view it as a series of interconnected systems. A third may rely on metaphors involving architecture, growth, exploration, or competition. These recurring patterns reveal how individuals organize experience mentally. Consequently, metaphor becomes not merely a rhetorical device, but a window into personal worldview. I once worked with an entrepreneur whose communication consistently revolved around navigational imagery. He spoke of charts, horizons, currents, storms, and destinations. Whether discussing business strategy, personal growth, or leadership challenges, similar metaphors appeared repeatedly. Over time, those expressions became part of his professional identity. Audiences remembered his presentations because the imagery felt coherent and authentic. He was not consciously manufacturing a brand. He was expressing a worldview through language. Authenticity, however, requires more than stylistic consistency. It also requires alignment between language and character. Some communicators attempt to adopt voices that seem impressive but feel unnatural. They imitate intellectual sophistication, corporate authority, or artistic depth without genuinely connecting to those identities. Such performances rarely remain convincing for long. Listeners possess remarkable sensitivity to authenticity. They may not identify every inconsistency consciously, yet they often sense when language feels disconnected from personality. Psychologically, authenticity creates trust because it reduces cognitive dissonance. When language, behavior, and values align, communication feels coherent. Audiences perceive sincerity. Conversely, when language appears artificial or exaggerated, credibility weakens. This is why developing an authentic voice requires self-awareness. Communicators must understand not only how they speak, but also who they are. Personal identity and linguistic identity evolve together. As learners approach the highest levels of proficiency, another transformation begins to occur. They stop asking, "What would a native speaker say?" and start asking, "How do I want to express this idea?" This shift is subtle but profound. The focus moves from external validation to internal expression. Language becomes a creative medium rather than a set of performance criteria. Confidence grows because communication no longer depends entirely upon imitation. I frequently encourage advanced students to pay attention to writers, speakers, and thinkers they admire. Not because those individuals should be copied directly, but because exposure to diverse styles helps reveal personal preferences. Some learners discover a love for concise elegance. Others develop appreciation for intellectual complexity. Some embrace humor, while others cultivate thoughtful seriousness. Through experimentation, patterns emerge. Gradually, an authentic voice takes shape. The process resembles assembling a mosaic. Individual influences contribute pieces, yet the final composition remains unique. Every book read, every conversation experienced, and every cultural perspective encountered adds new elements. Over time, these elements integrate into a distinctive communicative identity. No single influence dominates completely. Instead, the individual synthesizes them into something original. This synthesis represents one of the most rewarding aspects of advanced language development. Another characteristic of mature communicators is selective rule breaking. This idea often surprises learners because language education traditionally emphasizes correctness. Yet many exceptional speakers and writers occasionally deviate from conventional structures deliberately. They may fragment sentences for emphasis, repeat words for rhythm, or manipulate expectations creatively. Importantly, such choices emerge from mastery rather than ignorance. They understand the rules thoroughly enough to modify them strategically. I recall attending a lecture delivered by an author whose prose frequently violated traditional stylistic conventions. Yet every deviation served a purpose. Repetition created emotional intensity. Unusual phrasing captured attention. Unexpected pauses generated suspense. The language felt alive because it reflected intentional artistic choices rather than mechanical adherence to formula. This illustrates a crucial distinction. Experts do not abandon structure randomly. They adapt structure creatively. By this stage in our journey, we have traveled remarkably far together. We began with diplomatic language and strategic courtesy. We progressed through debate, negotiation, persuasion, leadership, crisis management, subtext, intellectual discourse, and philosophical expression. Each lesson expanded our understanding of what language can accomplish. Each stage added another layer of sophistication. Now, in this final lesson, we arrive at the realization that the ultimate purpose of mastery is not conformity, but individuality. Language at its highest level becomes an extension of self. Vocabulary reflects values. Rhythm reflects temperament. Metaphor reflects worldview. Style reflects identity. Communication ceases to be merely functional and becomes expressive. The speaker no longer strives simply to sound educated, persuasive, or fluent. Instead, the speaker strives to sound unmistakably authentic. This authenticity distinguishes memorable communicators from confident ones. As I reflect upon the countless students I have taught throughout my career, I notice that the most successful individuals rarely share identical communication styles. Their personalities differ, their professions differ, and their perspectives differ. Yet they possess one common trait. They have developed voices that feel genuinely their own. When they speak, audiences encounter not a collection of memorized techniques, but a coherent human presence expressed through language. And so our journey reaches its conclusion. What began as a quest for advanced English proficiency has gradually evolved into something much larger. Along the way, we have explored how language shapes relationships, organizations, ideas, and identities. We have examined the mechanics of communication and the psychology behind it. We have learned to navigate complexity, uncertainty, persuasion, leadership, and meaning itself. Now, as this final lesson comes to an end, I invite you to view language differently than when we first met. No longer see English merely as a foreign language to be mastered. See it as a medium through which your experiences, ambitions, values, and ideas can reach the world. Following our 15-minute final synthesis workshop, the cumulative journey will stand complete. The learner who once focused on grammar and vocabulary alone will have transformed into a commanding, sophisticated, and memorable global communicator, capable not only of speaking English fluently, but of speaking it with a voice that is uniquely, unmistakably, and authentically their own. And now, as our journey together finally reaches its destination, I want you to pause for a moment and reflect on how far you have come. When this course began, you may have been searching for better vocabulary, stronger grammar, or more confidence when speaking English. Yet along the way, you discovered something much greater. You learned how to communicate diplomatically, debate intelligently, negotiate strategically, persuade effectively, lead confidently, manage crises professionally, understand hidden meanings, engage in sophisticated conversations, express profound philosophical ideas, and ultimately develop a voice that is uniquely your own. Language has never been merely a collection of words. Language is the bridge between minds. It is the tool that allows us to share dreams, inspire action, build relationships, and leave a lasting impression on the people we meet. Every advanced phrase you learned, every subtle nuance you mastered, and every communication skill you developed is now part of a much larger transformation. You are no longer simply studying English. You are learning how to think, connect, and communicate on a truly global level. I sincerely hope these lessons have inspired you not only to improve your English, but also to become a more confident and thoughtful communicator in every aspect of life. Remember that mastery is not a destination. It is a lifelong journey. Every conversation you have, every book you read, every idea you explore, and every challenge you face will continue shaping your voice and expanding your understanding of the world. If you have enjoyed this lesson series and would like to continue learning advanced English through immersive stories, real-world communication strategies, and high-level vocabulary training, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a future lesson. Your support allows me to create more content designed to help learners like you reach true fluency and beyond. Thank you for spending this journey with me. Keep learning, keep growing, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep speaking with confidence. Until our next lesson, take care of yourself, stay curious, and remember that your voice has the power to make a difference in the world. Goodbye for now, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.